Painting silicone. In this tutorial, and of course this is part 5 of our 6-part series on making a little silicone creature, but in this video, in part 5, we're going to be painting the silicone cast that we made in a previous video. Now this is a TC-5110F platinum silicone skin that I backed with some 266 flexible foam. Now in part 5, in this video, we will be covering the process of painting this finished silicone skin using more of the 5110F platinum silicone. So our silicone skin is made of 5110F, and then we will also be using that as a paint medium. Now part 6, the final video in the series, will cover hair work, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Now there are a lot of details to getting a good paint job on a silicone piece like this, but here are the top 5 rules for successful painting of a silicone mask, creature, or whatever. First of all, paint silicone when it's fresh out of the mold. We'll be using 5110F as our skin. And you want to paint that as soon as possible after demolding, because in order to get 5110F, the new batch of silicone that you're using as a paint medium, to stick to the older cast silicone, it needs to be as fresh as possible. So I like to do this at least within a day of casting, if not sooner. Now, number 2, clean the silicone to remove any mold release residue. We used Zip 301 mold release to cast the silicone skin, so we need to make sure we remove any residue of that. And to do that, I will be using acetone, but you must clean the part, otherwise you will not be able to get more silicone to stick to it. Now, the next one is really important too. Thin your silicone with a compatible solvent. We'll be painting using 5110F as our paint base, and you want to make sure you're using a compatible solvent, but more about that later in the video. Also, this should be obvious, but use silicone pigment to color your silicone for painting. Don't use acrylic paints or oil paints or anything like that. For one thing, they aren't as concentrated, but also some of the colors can inhibit the platinum silicone. And last but certainly not least, make sure to dry your silicone with a hair dryer or a heat gun between each layer or each color of silicone paint. Now I mentioned the importance of a compatible thinner. So here are 3 different thinners that work with 5110F as a thinner when you're painting. So on the right hand side we have Naptha, and that's going to be probably the most readily available. And then we have the OSS, the odorless silicone solvant. And OSS is a cosmetic grade silicone solvent that's great for if you're doing prosthetic work or anything like that. But that is a little bit harder to get and a little more expensive. And then last but not least, we have solvent thinner from Sculpt Nouveau. And that's a great alternative to Naptha if you are in California. Now here are the main things you're going to need to paint silicone. Again, we'll be using the 5110F as our paint base. So we're going to need some clean polypropylene mixing cups, and that's important. Polypropylene will resist those solvents. And then of course we need our solvent, our Naptha, OSS, or solvent thinner. Popsicle sticks, you're going to use a lot of popsicle sticks. Nitrile gloves, don't use latex gloves. And oil paint brushes and chip brushes. And I say oil paint brushes because those are more resistant to solvents. Some of the watercolor brushes will come apart when they come in contact with solvent, so be very careful about that. And then of course silicone pigments, hair dryer so you can dry each layer and speed up that process, paper towels, and this one I can't stress enough, really good lighting. The better your lighting, the better your paint job will be. And of course, the silicone paint base, the TC-5110F. And of course, you could also use the regular 5110, but the fast setting version is what I prefer for this because I can just work so much faster with that, and I don't have to wait as long for that to cure between layers. Now, before we proceed, a quick word about safety. It's really important to remember anytime you're working with solvents, especially any of the petroleum solvents that I mentioned earlier. Always work in a well-ventilated area with gloves and a respirator. Thinned silicone, even when using odorless solvents, should never be inhaled. And even if you're brush painting or using flick brushes, and especially if you're going to be airbrushing, you will get some of those particles airborne. And if they go up your nose, remember that silicone does turn solid later, and you don't want anything that turns solid in your lungs. Now, for those of you new to painting with silicone, I'm going to mix up a small batch of silicone and just take you through all of the steps of mixing and applying a single color of silicone. So the first things first, we want to mix up our silicone, and of course this is TC-5110F. This is a fast setting soft silicone that has about a 7-minute working time at room temperature and about an hour, hour and a half demold. Now, the demold time doesn't really apply here since we're using it as a paint base, but that working time is really important to keep track of. Now, we don't want to use something too slow because we want to be able to move ahead with our project in a reasonable time frame. So that's why we're using that fast formula. So remember, we have 7 to 8 minutes or so to get everything mixed up and applied. Now, the first thing we need to do is pigment our silicone the color that we want for our paint. And in this case, I'm going to pigment this kind of a slightly light vascular color. I'm going to be mixing a little bit of red and a little bit of the flesh tone together. And that's usually what I do to add a little bit of life to the piece, to add a little bit of some pinks and reds to my color scheme and break up that flat look of just cast silicone. Now, by itself, that's already a pretty low viscosity material. Once we mix up 5110 with our silicone pigment, that's going to be fairly low viscosity, but we're going to thin it even more using naphtha. And I typically use about 30 to 50% naphtha. And you don't have to be precise here because the naphtha will evaporate off, leaving that silicone behind. And ultimately what happens is a two-stage process. You get both a curing process where your 5110F cures to a solid material, and then a drying process where the solvent evaporates out. Now, unless we go really heavy with our silicone pigments, we're going to wind up with more of a wash. And a lot of this is akin to watercolors. We want very transparent colors to help that realism out. And that's the whole point of using a translucent skin material and using washes of color over the top to give it a realistic look. But one of the things we want to be really careful about is not building this up more than is absolutely necessary to get the color we want. And this is why I mentioned in the previous video why it's really important to pigment your part that you're casting to the lightest color in the paint scheme, because you can darken it by adding color, but you can't lighten it without obscuring that translucency. Now, it's important that you clean your brushes after each layer is applied and use more of the solvent that you're using. In this case, I'm using naphtha to clean my brushes. And speed set that layer using a hairdryer. That'll speed that along and cause that silicone to cure faster than if you let it just sit out in the open air. Now, one of the reasons we're using naphtha to thin this, even for brush painting, is when we're applying silicone to our part. Say we've got our paint base and we're applying that over our silicone skin. We actually have two things occurring when we apply our silicone. So let's say we apply a light layer or wash of our silicone on our silicone skin. When we put that on and say we've thinned that 50% with naphtha, we're going to have two things occur once we apply our silicone colors. First, that silicone is going to gel and cure, and then it's going to dry, and that's going to cause it to shrink and grab that surface a little bit better, and also it's going to lower the cross-section of our paint and reduce the buildup that we have from multiple layers of paint. You want to be really careful about that, because if you're not careful at applying too many washes of color, you wind up building a significant layer of extra silicone on the surface of your part. So thinning with naphtha, even when we're brush painting, helps reduce the cross-section of the finished paint job. Now, overall, this little creature head that I'm painting for this video is pretty simple and straightforward, and I did this whole paint job in about 30 minutes to an hour or so. And I actually use several layers of paint at the same time. And you can do that once you're more experienced and you know kind of the limits of your abilities and the limits of the materials. But when you're starting out, it's a good idea to just paint one color at a time, and that way you don't risk kind of getting that muddy look by having those colors mixed together on your piece. So here I'm mixing up several colors to start out with, and I am using the fast version, the 5110F here, in several little batches. And I went ahead and mixed up about a 100-gram batch, and then I split that into about 4 25 or so gram batches. And now I'm adding my silicone pigments to those and thinning that with naphtha. And again, I got to move quick here because my working time starts as soon as the A and B of the silicone go together. So 5110F again has a working time of about 7 minutes at room temperature. So now I'm adding my naphtha and stirring that in, and as soon as I get that mixed in, I'm ready to move over to the piece and start painting. And for a paint job like this, I usually only use about 5 or 6 colors total. So I've got on the left-hand side, I have kind of a rose color, and that's what I'm going to use to establish the lip color. And then I like that yellow for breaking up that skin tone a little bit, and some blue for veining and also around the eyes, and then brown for freckles. And then I'm pouring up some additional naphtha to clean my brushes. And in addition to the nicer brushes that I'm using here, I also make up a few flick brushes that are just chopped down chip brushes. Now the first thing I like to do is go in around the eyes and add some of that rose color, and around the nose and the mouth. And sometimes I'll come back with a darker color later on, but I like to do that in layers so I don't build that up too fast or too thick accidentally. And then I stipple that all over the piece, sometimes about just random as possible all over this flesh tone. And what that does is it breaks up that cast flesh tone that I've got that's part of the piece. So the original flesh tone that's in the silicone that I cast with, I like to break that up as much as I can, because when you look at a real flesh tone, you're not seeing one homogeneous color. You're seeing all these colors that are then being mixed with your eyes. Now I'm going to do the same thing with some transparent blue and just apply light washes and actually over apply that in a few areas, and then come back with a paper towel and carefully dab that back off. And then each layer we can set that with a hairdryer before we proceed. But here I'm doing the same thing again with some yellow, some very transparent yellow. You obviously don't want to do this when the blue is still wet, or you'll create little blotches of green. So take care to dry each layer, and then dab off any excess. And real important to dab that off. That allows some of that paint to stay behind in the creases, and especially bring out some of the pore texture and detail. And again, this is a very simple sculpture and a very simple paint job, but real important to remember the basics here of keeping all of your colors very transparent when you're doing those washes. Now, the exception to that is these freckles that I'm going to do now. And I'm going to use a chopped down 1-inch chip brush to create a flick brush. And you can see there I can flick that onto a piece of white poster board or foam core board. It's a good way to test your flick brush before you move to your piece. And that way you can see kind of what kind of pattern you're getting. Make sure you get a good random pattern before you move to your piece. And now I'm just going to flick on little freckles all over. And this is where you definitely want to have a paper towel handy, because as soon as you flick on those freckles, occasionally you'll get a larger little drop or a freckle in a place you don't want it. And if you're careful, and especially if you've dried the previous layers with a hairdryer, you can very carefully wipe away any of that fresh silicone paint. So we're just going to very carefully flick that on. You see that's subtle enough. Some of those dots are barely even showing up on camera. And that's how you want it. You want to be building this up in gradual layers. And I realize this little guy, this is anything but subtle, but this is a great way to demonstrate these techniques. Now, in addition to flicking on little freckles, also using a flick brush and applying a red color. And sometimes for that red color, what I'll use is some of the red silicone pigment mixed with dark brown to also get kind of a darker red freckle. But it also, if you do that in a really light spatter, it just adds a lot of life to the piece, but you want that to be very subtle. You don't want to be too heavy-handed with that freckle technique. And now I'm going in and painting the inside of the nose, inside of the mouth. And you see I've gone over the lips a little bit there, but while this is fresh, we can easily go back with a paper towel and wipe away any of that silicone before it sets. But that's why you're going to go through a lot of paper towels and a lot of disposable popsicle sticks and chip brushes when you're doing this technique. Now that darker red freckle color, you'll see that in play here. And again, you see I've got my clean foam core board, so I can check that pattern and see how that looks first. Always a good idea to check that before you start flicking paint onto your piece. And that way you can just make sure you got the color right and you know how it's going to look before you start putting it in an area that might be difficult to remove it. So again, we're just going to flick that on. And this, of course, is totally separate batches of silicone than what you saw me mix up initially there. That silicone has long since cured and we've moved on. I just wanted to show you that as kind of a frame of reference for how I'm working here. And each layer after you apply it, if you want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the next layer, hit it with a hairdryer. And if you use a hairdryer on high, that will cause it to gel quick enough that you can go ahead and add more material over the top without worrying about that muddying up that paint job. And again, I'm just dabbing off any of those spots of silicone paint that were too big, that created too big of little drops or freckles. And now I'm creating some veins with the transparent blue. This is a second batch of transparent blue that I mixed up. And I'm using this to draw on some veins on the forehead and on the neck. And what I typically do for that is kind of over apply that and then carefully dab it off to just leave a very subtle look of a vein. And I realize there is nothing subtle about this little creature, but this was, a little side note here, this was actually modeled after Quato from Total Recall, I believe from 1990. Introduced one of my daughters to that, the one who will be wearing this costume, by the way, and she wanted her little parasitic twin to look like Quato. So, spoiler alert, this is going to be a parasitic twin. Now, once I've got those vein colors in place, I don't want to do too much over the top of that unless I want to conceal that. But I want to put those veins on there and allow those to dry. And again, we can always speed that up with a hairdryer or a heat gun. And all told, I probably applied maybe half a dozen layers of silicone paint to this piece. And a lot of that is in very thin washes and not even all over the entire piece. So the main thing you want to be aware of is you want to be very conservative with your use of silicone paint, because too many layers will start building up more thickness on the surface of your silicone that makes the piece look kind of waxy. So in order to make sure you preserve that original detail, you want to work in thin washes and use as few layers of color as possible. And that's, again, why it's really important in the casting stage to get your color of your cast part as close as possible to the paint scheme you're going to be using later on. Because obviously things like veins and freckles and things like that have to be painted later, but you want as much of that intrinsic color as possible to be close to the final paint job so that you don't have to do any more work than is necessary to get a realistic paint job. And at the beginning, when I was using that silicone ear, remember it's really handy to keep your little scrap pieces of silicone around for paint tests like this, and that way you can see exactly what something is going to look like before you proceed. Now, this is the following day. I usually like to let my silicone paint cure completely in several hours, if not overnight, before I start doing things like popping the eye forms into place or anything like that. So this is after it's had many hours to sit, at least 7 or 8 hours to sit and completely cure and dry. When it doesn't smell like solvent anymore, that's a good indicator you're ready to proceed. You can see those eye forms pop right in thanks to the allowance from the original eye forms in the sculpture. And you can adjust those with a dental tool, and if you want, you can secure those with some clear silicone sealant. Now, the last step in the painting process is matting our sculpture. Now, you can use translucent face powder, but kind of the Cadillac of products for this is Tom McLaughlin's silicone finishing powder. It just takes a little bit of this stuff, and it really helps give you a nice matte finish, a nice permanent matte finish on your cast silicone part, and remove that gloss from a fresh paint job like this. And I'm avoiding the mouth because obviously I want it to look glossy and wet around the mouth. And now our silicone paint job is done, and we're ready to apply some hair and eyelashes. So stay tuned for our final video in this series. And of course, as always, all of the materials I used in this tutorial will be linked in the video description. So be sure to check all of those out because there's a lot of specific materials to this process, so they'll all be linked in the video description. Now, if you just found this video, I'll link the other parts in the series on the end screen, so be sure to check that out. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe. And of course, thanks for watching.